Analogy may be the single most important factor in studying how myths are formed. In fact, analogy may be the single most important factor in how we learn anything. Many neuroscientists hold it to be crucial to the learning process. We draw an analogy when we see a similarity between two things. One of the mythical principles here is that we tend to relate things that resemble each other. You can see some relation to post hoc here. These are ways in which the brain is hardwired. Let's give some examples of how this might happen. Mountains are like chimneys. Both smoke, both have fire within. Humans send messengers to relay information, thus the gods must also have messengers. A tidal wave is like a bull. If humans can get married to humans, then, by analogy, humans can also symbolically marry gods. We notice that some things reside inside of other things. For instance, if we get food from the pantry, it's because the food resides within the pantry. It is but a short analogical jump to claim that since we get fire from the flint, the fire must dwell within the flint. Another example, consider the dung beetle. The ancients were very inventive in their analogies. When they saw a dung beetle, for instance, they saw a picture of the sun god pushing the sun up into the sky. Thus, the dung beetle or scarab takes on a sacred significance for Egyptian culture. It may have been from icons depicting sun gods that the Greeks derived their famous myth of Sisyphus, who is condemned to eternally roll a rock up a mountain. Here is a sample of a few principles that flow from the concept of analogy. First, the willfulness principle. Here, from the fact that we cause events to happen by willing them to happen, the analogy is drawn to non-human causes. When events happen in the natural world, they must have been willed to happen by something or somebody, possibly a god. There are a few interesting corollaries to the willfulness principle. For instance, the kinship principle. If things are similar, they must be related, from which we get related groups of gods, such as the winds, who are seen as brothers, and the fates, who are seen as sisters, as are the muses and the graces. The obverse of this is the adversary principle. If things are antithetical to each other, they must be adversaries. The most obvious example here is good and evil, which, when personified, are seen as God versus Satan. So also with hot and cold, life and death, and so forth. Another consequence of analogical thinking is sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is based on the belief that like affects like. Thus, if you want to harm your enemy, you can more easily curse him if you have a bit of his hair or clothing. The same idea is present in voodoo, where a representation of the person is made, and then whatever is done to this icon is done to the person it represents. This magic also lies behind the practice of homeopathic medicine, as well as belief in concepts such as karma and synchronicity. Interestingly, Frazer, author of The Golden Bough, saw magic as containing the rudimentary beginnings of scientific law. Finally, analogical thinking gives us the principle of metaphorical reality. The best way to understand this is to think of an event that is originally described as a simile. The tidal wave roared down on the village like a raging bull. And then imagine, as the story is told through the ages, that the like in the simile is eventually dropped, so that the tidal wave becomes a raging bull. Sometime later, a story is told about an ancient raging bull that destroyed the village. This is probably why volcanoes are often described in ancient stories in terms of hair or snakes trailing down mountainsides, as in the Klamath story. The metaphor has become real. This might also explain why Medusa was said to have snakes for hair. A few other interesting stories concerning the consequences of analogy. The ancient Hittites were said to have derived their iron ore from the Calibians, a tribe of people living near the Black Sea. From this ore they would make their swords and armor, which was said to be out of Calibia, or Excalibia, from which is derived Excalibur, the name of the sword that Arthur was said to have pulled from the stone. Getting a sword from stone is how all swords are made. And then there are the fire-breathing dragons. Everyone is familiar with the fire-breathing dragon who sits guarding its hoard of gold. There's an interesting explanation for the origin of stories such as this. In ancient times, great warriors like Beowulf were buried in caves or pits, surrounded not only by their fellow warriors, but by much gold and silver. Generations later, treasure hunters would go looking for this buried treasure, using their lanterns to peer into the dark recesses of caves and pits. Obviously, in their explorations, they would come upon various sorts of snakes and other ground dwellers. But even more interesting, when they broke into a tomb containing long dead bodies, there may very well have been a buildup of methane gas, which their lanterns would have ignited, causing a firing explosion. Afterward, if they survived, they may have explained such things by making up stories of fire-breathing snakes or dragons guarding the treasures of the dead. These are some of the consequences of analogical thinking in the ancient world. In this presentation, we have looked at both orality and primitive logic in an attempt to show how myths may have originally been formed or shaped. Obviously, we have only scratched the surface of these subjects. Keep the points we have made in mind throughout the course as we study various myths.